The sound that woke Harold Whitman that morning was not the rooster, and it was not the wind moving through the cornfields the way it always did at dawn. It was engines, dozens of them, rolling closer with every passing second, and as Harold stepped out onto the porch in his worn flannel shirt, coffee mug shaking slightly in his hand, he felt something tighten in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, a fear that had visited him many times before, but that he thought he had finally outrun. More than 40 trucks were coming down the long gravel road toward his farm, kicking up dust that hung in the morning light like smoke. And in a small town like Mill Haven, Iowa, where Harold had lived his entire life, a convoy like that could only mean one thing: the bank. After everything, after all the years of scraping by, of patching machines with wire and prayer, of pretending to Evelyn's memory that he was managing just fine on his own, Harold was certain this was the day it all ended. His coffee mug slipped from his fingers and shattered against the porch boards, and he didn't even notice because his eyes were fixed on the road, watching the trucks grow larger, watching them turn one by one onto his property. To understand why this moment meant so much, you have to go back more than 30 years, long before Harold's hair turned white and his hands grew stiff with age. Back to a time when the farm was struggling, but Harold was still strong enough to fight for it. Back to the afternoon a stranger first appeared at his gate. Harold was 48 years old that year, his wife Evelyn beside him every step of the way, and the two of them were doing everything they could to keep the family farm from slipping through their fingers the way so many farms around Mill Haven already had. The debt had been growing for years, slow and quiet, like a leak in a roof that you keep telling yourself you'll fix later. Harold worked from before sunrise until long after dark, and even then the numbers never seemed to come out right. Evelyn watched her husband grow thinner and quieter with each passing season, watched the way he'd sit at the kitchen table after she'd gone to bed, staring at bills he already knew he couldn't pay. And though he never said much about it, she could feel the weight of it pressing down on him every single day. It was on one of those long, exhausting afternoons that Harold first saw the young man standing at the end of his gravel drive. He looked to be in his mid-20s, tall but stooped like the world had been pressing down on his shoulders for longer than someone his age should have to bear. His jacket was too thin for the weather, his boots were worn through at the soles, and the duffel bag slung over his shoulder looked like everything he owned in the world was packed inside it. He stood at the gate without stepping past it, as though some part of him wasn't sure he had the right to. Harold set down the wrench he'd been holding and walked toward him, and as he got closer, he could see the exhaustion etched into the young man's face, the kind of exhaustion that came not just from a hard day, but from many hard days strung together with no end in sight. "Can I help you?" Harold asked, his voice gentle despite the roughness of his hands and the tiredness of his own long day. The young man hesitated, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "My name's Eli Parker," he said. "I've been on the road a while, lost my job a few months back, and then, well, things just kept going wrong after that. I was hoping maybe you had work, anything. I don't need much, sir, just a chance." Harold studied him for a long moment. He was 26 years old, Eli told him later, though in that moment he looked both older and younger than that all at once. Old in the way his eyes carried more than they should have, young in the way he still flinched slightly, as if expecting to be turned away. Harold had every reason to say no. The farm couldn't support another mouth to feed, let alone pay another set of wages, and Harold barely had enough to keep his own family afloat. But there was something about the way Eli stood there, not demanding anything, not even really expecting anything, just hoping, quietly, the way a man hopes when hope is the only thing he has left. And Harold thought of his own son, gone now for many years, taken too soon in an accident that still ached in his chest like an old wound that never fully closed. His son would have been close to Eli's age now had he lived. "Well," Harold said slowly, "I reckon there's always work that needs doing around a place like this. Can't pay much, not at first, but there's a roof over the barn loft, and Evelyn makes sure nobody round here goes hungry.
Eli's eyes filled with something Harold recognized immediately because he'd felt it himself once, a long time ago. The feeling of being seen by someone when you'd started to believe the world had stopped looking. "Thank you," Eli said, his voice cracking slightly. "I won't let you down, sir." And he didn't. From that first morning, Eli worked harder than any hired hand Harold had ever known, rising before dawn and not stopping until well after dark, never once complaining, never once asking for more than what was given. Evelyn fed him at their table every night, and slowly the quiet, guarded young man began to open up, sharing pieces of his story in small fragments, how he'd grown up bouncing between relatives after his parents passed when he was young, how he'd worked factory jobs that never lasted, how he'd always wanted to understand machines but never had the chance to learn properly. That last part caught Harold's attention more than anything, because what he noticed about Eli wasn't just his work ethic, it was the way he watched everything, the way he crouched beside Harold whenever something broke down, studying every movement, asking quiet, careful questions. Within weeks, Eli was making small repairs on his own. Within a couple of months, he was fixing things Harold himself had given up on years ago, old equipment that Harold had simply learned to work around because there was never enough money to fix it properly. One evening, after Eli had spent hours bringing the farm's ancient grain auger back to life, Harold stood watching him with a quiet kind of wonder, thinking that this young man had something rare in him, something that with the right opportunity could become something much bigger than either of them could see standing in that barn.
But hard work alone wasn't going to save the farm, and Harold knew it. The debt kept climbing no matter how many hours Eli put in, and Harold could feel the walls closing in a little more with every passing month. It was around that time, late one night at the kitchen table, that Harold told Evelyn what he'd been thinking about for weeks. "I want to sell Samson," he said quietly, and Evelyn looked up at him in surprise, because Samson was their prize Angus bull, the best animal Harold had ever bred, representing years of careful work and the farm's best hope for rebuilding its herd. Selling him wouldn't fix everything, but it would be enough, Harold explained, enough to send Eli somewhere he could get real training, real education, a real foundation to build a life on. Evelyn reached across the table and took her husband's hand. "You're not thinking about the farm right now, are you?" she said softly, and it wasn't really a question. Harold shook his head slowly. "I keep thinking about that boy standing at our gate," he said. 26 years old, and nobody left in the world who believed in him. "We can't fix everything, Evelyn, but we can fix that." When Harold told Eli what he'd decided, the young man was speechless, his eyes filling with tears he tried hard not to let fall. He kept saying it wasn't right, that Harold couldn't give up something so valuable for him, that he hadn't earned it. But Harold just placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Son, the value of a thing isn't always about what it's worth. Sometimes it's about what it can become." Before Eli left for the vocational training program in Springfield, Harold pressed a small folded piece of paper into his hand. Eli unfolded it slowly and read the single line written there in Harold's rough handwriting. "Don't quit when you're halfway there." He looked up at Harold, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because some moments don't need words, only the weight of being felt. The years that followed were not easy for Eli. Springfield was bigger and colder than anything he'd known, and more than once he found himself sitting alone in a small rented room with nothing but a bowl of plain rice for dinner, wondering if he'd made a mistake leaving the only place that had ever felt like home. There was one night in particular when everything felt too heavy, when Eli sat on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands, certain he was going to fail, certain he should just give up and disappear the way he had disappeared from so many places before. But his hand found the worn piece of paper in his jacket pocket, soft now from being unfolded so many times, and he read those 6 words again, and something in him steadied, like a hand on his shoulder, reminding him he wasn't walking that road alone. He stayed. He finished at the top of his class, and slowly, painstakingly, he built himself into someone new, first as a technician, then as a shop manager, and eventually as the owner of his own company, one that specialized in repairing and maintaining the very kind of agricultural equipment he had first learned to fix in Harold Whitman's barn. The company grew, year after year, until Eli Parker, the 26-year-old who had once stood hungry and exhausted at a stranger's gate,
was a man in his late 50s who employed hundreds of people across several states. But no matter how far he traveled, no matter how much his life changed, Eli never forgot the man who had given him that piece of paper, and with it, everything. Meanwhile, back in Millhaven, the years had not been gentle to Harold. Evelyn had passed away a few years back, and without her steady presence beside him, the farmhouse felt larger and quieter than it ever had before. The debts Harold had spent his whole life trying to outrun had finally caught up with him in a way he could no longer manage, and he knew deep down that this might be the farm's last season. Every morning he walked out to the porch with his coffee and looked over the fields his family had worked for generations, and he felt a quiet ache, not just for himself, but for the land, for everything it had meant. And then came the morning of the engines. Harold stood frozen on the porch as the engines rolled down his gravel drive and came to a stop in front of his house. Neighbors stepped out onto their own porches, murmuring in confusion, some saying it had to be the bank, others saying it must be some kind of mistake. Harold simply stood there, his heart pounding, as the lead truck's door opened and a man stepped down, somewhere in his late 50s, with silver streaks through his dark hair and the quiet confidence of someone who had built something real with his own hands. The man looked across the yard at Harold, and slowly he smiled. "Hello, Mr. Whitman," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Harold's breath caught. He knew that voice, even after all these years. "Eli?" he managed, barely above a whisper. And in 3 long strides, Eli crossed the yard and wrapped his arms around the old farmer, holding him the way a son holds a father after years apart. Behind him, the doors of the other trucks opened, and dozens of men and women in matching uniforms stepped out, carrying tools and equipment, spreading across the property, not like strangers come to take something, but like people who had come to give something back. "What is all this?" Harold finally asked, his voice trembling. Eli reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times it had gone soft as cloth, and placed it gently in Harold's hands. Harold unfolded it, and there were the words he had almost forgotten writing more than 30 years before. "Don't quit when you're halfway there." "You gave me this when I had nothing," Eli said quietly. "When I was 26 years old and the whole world had given up on me, you sold the best thing you owned just to give me a chance. Every time I wanted to quit, I read this. You didn't just help me survive, Mr. Whitman. You gave me a future." Over the following days, Eli's crews worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing every piece of aging equipment, restoring the barn, and quietly settling the debts that had hung over Harold for years. When Harold tried to argue that it was too much, Eli simply said, "You once told me the value of a thing isn't about what it's worth, but what it can become. Well, look what this farm became. Look what I became. It all started with you and Evelyn." Harold passed away peacefully a few years later, surrounded by people who loved him, and the farm remained, cared for and visited often by the man who never forgot where he came from, and who made sure the story of that farm and the kindness that saved it twice would never be forgotten. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, the ones that seem to cost the most at the time, come back to us multiplied beyond anything we could have imagined, not as debts repaid, but as love returned. If this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe, because stories like Harold and Eli's deserve to be told again and again, and your subscription helps us bring more true-to-life stories of kindness and quiet courage to your screen. If you believe that kindness always finds its way back, even after 30 years, leave a comment below, because we read every single one, and your words inspire the next story we share. And if there's someone in your life who once gave you a chance when you had nothing, someone who believed in you before you believed in yourself, share this video with them. Because sometimes the best way to say thank you is to let them know it mattered. This story reflects the lasting impact of generosity given without expectation of return, the importance of believing in people who feel forgotten, and the way that genuine kindness, offered freely, often shapes the course of someone's entire life and returns multiplied in ways no one could predict.